Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us for the NARM Online Basics training to become a NARM-informed professional. This is the Level 1 training in the neuroaffective relational model for helping professionals working with complex trauma. This professional training is designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. This training is for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, body workers, and more. In this online training, participants will learn more about the changing field of trauma, a deeper understanding of the impacts of ACEs and complex trauma, and how NARM, one of the first models specifically designed to address CPTSD, can support professionals in the growing trauma-informed field. This NARM Online Basics training will be taught by NARM senior faculty members Brad Kammer and Stephanie Klein, as well as a team of experienced NARM trainers with special instruction by NARM creator, Dr. Laurence Heller. If you are looking for more advanced training in understanding the impacts of attachment, relational, developmental, and intergenerational trauma, and you're working in healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, please join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. The next NARM Online Basics training is starting in September 2021 and will run one weekend a month through December 2021. 60 continuing education units will be available for most helping professionals. Register now to reserve your spot. Please visit www.narmtraining.com/onlinebasics. We hope you'll join us in learning how to transform trauma. And now for today's interview. Today's guest is Julie Brown Yau, Ph.D. Julie has a 33-year background in psychological, somatic, and spiritual traditions, providing a unique depth of knowledge and experience. Julie specializes in developmental trauma, intergenerational, and acute trauma. She's an author and speaker, and also the trauma and spiritual care consultant for ALS. Julie is an authorized teacher of Shri Vidya, which combines the resolution of trauma with spiritual practice. Julie has a private practice in Laguna Beach, California, and works on Skype or Zoom worldwide. Please enjoy my very inspirational conversation with Julie Brown Yau. Hello, Julie Brown Yau. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this topic. But before we dig into that, the first question that we ask on the podcast is much like a NARM session. And we want to know what you would love for listeners to get out of our time together today.
Some inspiration around working with trauma and maybe some understanding about the relationship of trauma and spirituality. I know in the field, there's quite a little bit of misunderstanding between these two paths, if you will. So it'd be nice to give some clarity around that and how they naturally come together and how they can support one another. If people are open to that, of course, not everybody's interested in a spiritual approach with trauma, and that's fine. But even in saying that, in healing trauma, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit, it begins to look somewhat spiritual as we, open up and go beyond our ordinary sense of self.
Yes, you and I are very aligned on this topic, so I can't wait to dig into it.
Right.
So I know that you're NARM trained. We talked before we started recording that you were in the very first NARM training. So I'm curious your path to finding NARM.
Well, I knew Dr. Heller when he was an SE teacher, but I also have that in my background. So as soon as I knew he was teaching NARM and it was about developmental trauma, I jumped in straight away. I have a background going back 30 years, almost 30 years, when I first started to look into developmental trauma. And it wasn't called that back then, or complex trauma.
What was it called?
When I was looking at it, when I was studying, we were looking at work that was coming up out of Wilhelm Reich's body armoring. So the body dynamics or Alexander Lowen's work and core energetics. So Somatic psychology is really what we were looking at, but weren't thinking of it so much as trauma. It was a very, very different way to address trauma back then than we address it now. I mean, back then, I remember sitting in a room with 200 people, and the way that they were teaching, half the class was going to drop into a regressed state of childhood or babyness.
Oh my gosh.
And the other half was going to be supporting those people and mothering them. And as we know today, any kind of regressive state is potentially re-traumatizing. It certainly doesn't seem to be healing. And I remember innately knowing this was not a healthy or healing experience. But again, trauma's changed our understanding of trauma, how we address it, especially complex trauma and developmental trauma, as advanced. And I think Dr. Heller in his NARM work has really helped bring those nuances and refinement to that kind of work too.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about what you do, and then we can hear about how you utilize NARM in your work.
Well, I would say there's 3 different areas where I'm working, where I'm applying my knowledge of both trauma and spirituality. One is my private practice, and I work in person or on Skype, a lot of countries around the world I work with. And I'm doing work that is working with developmental trauma, right, or complex trauma. Most people will contact me because of their understanding of developmental trauma. They've heard me talk about it and then reached out. Another area I work is with an organization called Compassionate Care ALS. So it's an organization that's helping people in every way possible you could imagine, families who are experiencing ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. Part of my work there, actually, which I really love right now, which I think is brilliant for this organization, is they're bringing me in to work with the people who are working with the families who are facing death and all the chaos that comes up. Because you can imagine if you're working in an environment where people are suffering with a disease that is, slowly taking away any kind of movement they have and dying, it can trigger a tremendous amount of your own trauma. So they brought me in also to help work with that. So it helps prevent compassion fatigue and burnout. It helps them hold a broader understanding of what's happening within themselves and around them. So that's another area I work. And the other area is directly bringing together trauma and spirituality. This is something I've just recently began to do, is holding webinars and workshops where I, on purpose, bring together spiritual teachings with trauma. And I do it in a way that I haven't seen anybody else doing it right now, with the way that I'm working. One, I'm an authorized teacher to bring teachings from a particular spiritual lineage called Shri Vidya. I combine those teachings with looking at trauma. And as you know, people on a spiritual path, at some point, trauma is going to be triggered. It's inevitable. So spiritual traditions really are not designed to work with trauma, to help heal trauma or to navigate trauma. They're just not. They're about waking up to our true nature, And we could say the same with healing trauma. Healing trauma is really not designed to help you recognize expanded states of consciousness. Now, we might drop into them and feel them, but they can be fleeting. And there's a limitation, depending who you're working with, of course, but there can be a limitation on the recognition and then maybe how to work with those states for them to become more grounded or embodied traits of being. So as I bring these two paths together, what I found is people are really having profound experiences of support from this tradition, and we can speak more to it if you like.
Yes, please.
Resolution of trauma. And I wasn't quite sure how it was going to look. I was taking a bit of a risk in doing it, but intuitively and instinctively, I wanted to see what happened. Beautiful results.
Yeah. Would you share more about that tradition?
So the tradition is an Indian tradition, Eastern lineage tradition called Shri Vidya. It's such a vast body of work and knowledge, and it goes back a couple thousand years at least, probably more than that, a few thousand years, we could say. Just to give a simple explanation of what we work with is, I'm going to use the word goddess. we work with goddesses. Now that has its own baggage that it can come with, but let me explain really what that is. It's working with a field of consciousness. And I think that simplifies it for people and can take out some of the baggage that maybe the word goddess has. Mm-hmm. So we work with these very refined states of consciousness, and we connect with them, and we connect with them through a mantra. Now, mantra from the Sanskrit alphabet, like it's not really an alphabet, it's a matrix of consciousness in itself. Each particular mantra connects to a particular field of consciousness and connects us to that field of consciousness and brings something to us. So for instance, I've just taught a webinar with a particular field of consciousness or goddess called Chamunda. She's actually very fierce and was an unusual goddess to bring to work with on healing trauma because of her fierce look and her fierce nature. But what she brought is a capacity to cut through our limiting beliefs, to cut through our ignorance, if you will, not ignorance of what we don't know, but the ignorance of seeing a particular way that's not actually the truth. Mm-hmm. So this field of consciousness helps energetically shift our consciousness to see more clearly by saying the mantra, by doing the visualization. And the visualization is to visualize what we would call a goddess. But this is an anthropomorphized image that helps the mind hold on to something because we can't yet maybe hold on or open up to the absolute or higher states of spaciousness. So the image is really giving the mind something to hold on to. But the yogis of old were really depth psychologists, understanding symbols and images. And of course, these symbols and images are going to come out of the Indian tradition. So many of the gods and goddesses, I'd say, have this long, black, flowing hair. That long, black, flowing hair is symbolic of the vastness, of the darkness of the heart space.
Ooh, I just want to sit with that for a second. That's big.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we don't have to know that, because we share this collective consciousness, even across cultures, that just symbolically there's a resonance in our own psyche when we see this image that something is going to resonate. So also the implements that you often see these gods and goddesses holding, they're symbolic that will resonate with something in our own psyche that brings us something that we may not cognitively be aware of. So in my classes, I really go in depth in speaking about this. This is not some esoteric woo-woo, I'm a goddess, meet the goddess, become a goddess. Right. There's a profound depth of science that goes back, as I say, thousands of years, and understanding what it is we're doing. But we can simplify, I don't even know if it's simplifying, but we can bring some of these teachings, ancient teachings, and apply them to our contemporary needs. And I say to people, if you're interested, read a little bit more about it on my website, sign up for the newsletter, listen. And if it interests you in any way, then take up the practice and find out for yourself. Initially, a lot of people who came were people who'd seen me teaching or on a webinar or in a class teaching something and had some sense of, okay, this seems like a pretty grounded teaching in person. So I trust her, I'm going to come and try it out. And sure enough, people would have experiences of these practices, spiritual practices, helping them with their trauma, resolving their trauma in ways that I actually didn't expect, and neither did they. Everybody's pretty thrilled at that happening.
Well, as you were talking, specifically when you were talking about the goddess, I was having some somatic experience. And at first I felt like I was going to cry. And then there was just some sort of energy around just between my throat chakra and my heart space. And I don't know what that's about. We don't have to even make meaning out of it, but there was some sort of energy with that. So I can only imagine, really spending a lot of time deepening into that, how profound it must be.
Yeah. And the other piece about Shri Vidya, these teachings, they're embodied teachings. A lot of spiritual traditions aren't looking at embodiment, aren't including the body even. But Shri Vidya does, and that was one of the reasons I got drawn to it. Actually, it landed on my doorstep, if you will.
I was going to say, yeah, please tell us, how did you encounter it?
I've been involved in spiritual traditions for over 30 years. So I began meditating when I was a teenager because my father was a martial artist. And in his practice, at the beginning of class, we would sit and meditate. So that's what I did. Very, very simple practice. To me, it was just part of life, right? I was a teenager. This is what you do. It wasn't about seeking something. It wasn't about enlightenment. It was a way to connect to our subtle energies in the body, to the earth, to the heavens above, I think we would say in that practice. And so when I was in a difficult period of life around 18 years old, I remembered that practice and sat down and began it. And for me, and maybe many people who are practicing some form of embodied meditation early on, maybe we get wired more from a neurological perspective to open up readily to spiritual states. I don't know. I know trauma can also catalyze that. But anyway, my life just started to open up in ways spiritually in my body of these experiences that kind of blew my mind and blew my belief systems, which is phenomenal. But then I would go out and try and understand it. And it was the spiritual traditions, specifically at that time, Tibetan Buddhism, that allowed me to deepen and understand what was occurring and then continue to practice. The community that I was in for about 15 years, some unfortunate things began to happen within that. That tends to, right, in any human group.
Oh, humans.
Over time. And so I sort of backed away from it a little bit, but not the teachings. And then I was walking in the town where I live one day, and I bumped into the Ayurvedic doctor, and she was in a little bit of distress. And she said, Julie, I have this teacher coming, and we don't have a place now for her to teach. And she needs her own room and her own bathroom, and we need a space that's conducive to these teachings. And really without thinking, I said, you can use my home. 2 days later, this beautiful Indian woman crosses the threshold of my door into my home. Right from a depth psychological perspective, we could say she walked into my psyche with these teachings. And I really didn't know I was going to participate in them the way that I did. I was really happy with where I was. But these teachings were incredible. And I found her brilliant and amazing and tremendously embodied. She also had an interest in trauma. So we had many discussions on both trauma and spirituality. And she will has referred people to me or refer her students outwards when trauma comes up. Even though this tradition, more than any other tradition, I think is equipped to feel emotions, complete emotions, embraces emotions, and so forth, than any other tradition I really know, in a way where we can develop more capacity to feel. But even so, it's not equipped to work directly with complex trauma and especially childhood trauma. I was captivated. I was drawn in. I took up the practices myself. And then 15 or so years later, I'm authorized to teach.
Wow. And I'm curious what it looks like in the room when you marry these two practices. And if you have any, I'll ask that question first. I love to ask like 12 questions at one time, just see where you go, but let's just do one at a time today.
So how it looks when I bring these two together, I'll always initiate with trauma. My passion in the world, it's both trauma and spirituality. Spirituality is really my own deep personal path.
Yeah.
Bringing trauma and helping people with trauma is a huge passion. So I'll speak to trauma first and developmental trauma. And always when I'm advertising or marketing these classes, it's about both, bringing our trauma, but also utilizing this tradition or honoring this tradition that can support us. And also honoring what these traditions are about, which are awakening or to recognize our wholeness, which I think is a little different from trauma, which is to reclaim our wholeness. We see it in different ways. It gives a little bit of perspective of the difference. So how does it look? People may speak a little bit about their trauma, and we'll address that. And then I'll introduce the teachings, and I'll expand a lot more of what I have just spoken about, of what a goddess is from this tradition. Ultimately, it's no different. This consciousness is no different than who we are. But we don't say I'm that until we directly realize I'm that. Otherwise, it's an intellectual concept, which really doesn't get us anywhere. But there's an understanding that we're moving towards something that we already are, we just haven't yet realized, our true nature. Or in trauma, we're moving towards our deeper nature, who we were before the world maybe interfered with us and made us afraid to be in the body or afraid of our emotions. And we adapted ways of being, thinking this is the way the world is. So I bring these paths together to say, we are dissolving our adaptations to know who we truly are. The fields of consciousness that we work with in these teachings can help hold and support us with that energetically. And people will feel that, again, by having the visualizations, by having the mantra. We also have something called a yantra, which is a geometrical image that's connected to the more subtle energies or subtle consciousnesses that we're working with. And people will have an experience. And it doesn't have to be big and profound. It'll be, wow, I feel supported by something more than who I know myself to be. And something other that I think is beautiful working with goddesses specifically is that people connect with her in her various forms and have an experience of a mother who loves them unconditionally. Developmental trauma, our mothers, our fathers, often unintentionally, sometimes, let's just say unintentionally, are passing on through intergenerational trauma, inherited trauma, or directly not being able to be there to give us what we need to feel safe in our body, in the world, in our emotions, and so forth. And so when these two practices come together, people are experiencing a mother-like energy supporting them and holding them that gives them something that they didn't get. And one of the ways of healing trauma is to be able to give ourselves something that was missed, or a lot of what was missed. And so she helps us feel that for ourselves, because by the very nature of signing up for these teachings, we are giving ourselves something that we didn't have. Compassion, profound sense of compassion that can hold us. And of course, we need more than compassion, I believe, but that compassion and that love that comes through, or the fierceness, changes something in a direct way in our body-mind system.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny, you answered my question, because as you were talking, I was asking myself, I wonder if there's something particular about it being a goddess, being female energy. And you said, yeah, it's the mother, which I feel that very deeply.
Yeah, it's beautiful the way that people express their experience of her. And we also bring gods in too, but Shri Vidya is particularly focused on the feminine energy, the feminine principle of the universe. So it's not woman, man.
Right.
It's an energetic principle. But we also bring in the masculine principle. Each Shakti, each goddess, or Ishtadevata traditionally are they called, has an opposite consort, the masculine consort. Mm-hmm. So it's the same if we're working with a god. He has a female counterpart. So there's always a balance there. There's always the combination of masculine and feminine. But we focus mainly on the goddess in her many forms. And people will say, I'm going to bring something forward of something that someone said. So it's not a replacement of their mother, but it's a recognition of some of the aspects that maybe she couldn't bring, that brought in the trauma or traumatized them or disrupted their own nervous system and body-mind.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, this is a little bit of a deviation, but still on the path of trauma, but more around collective trauma. I'm just thinking about, bringing in these feminine energies, this goddess energy. I'm sure it's not quite like this. I'm saying the wrong words, but hopefully you'll take it and run with it. But essentially to kind of counteract the patriarchal trauma that has happened for whenever the dawn of patriarchy started, which I don't have that date in front of me, but yeah. Right, is there something to that?
I believe so. Mm-hmm. We're hearing more about Shakti and the feminine across the board in so many areas of life. And here she is coming in to work with trauma. I believe there's a balance taking place. And this is why I love Shri Vidya, because it's primarily working with the feminine principle that has been squashed in so many ways for centuries now. So the tradition and these goddesses, she brings something that's been missing, even if we're not aware of that, because we've all been in these masculine dominating societies for a long time that we may not even recognize it until we begin to bring in the counterpart of the feminine, of the goddess, to help balance that out and bring more of an equilibrium. So these teachings definitely do that. And then therefore will begin to heal the trauma of these patriarchs in subtle and not so subtle ways. There's a profound strength in embodying the feminine.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I think we see a lot of the feminine or women embodying the masculine, thinking it's being more feminine or becoming more masculine. There's a difference in the feeling tone when we connect more to the feminine energies that people may not have just had an experience of yet. So when we work with Shakti, feminine energy, we get a direct experience then of what that internal power is. That might be different from what we've experienced or thought it might be.
Absolutely. I'd love to, if you wouldn't mind expanding when you talk about the collective energies. That's something I really believe in. And I'm curious if some listeners might not be quite sure exactly what that is or what you mean by that.
Well, for instance, I'm from England, originally. I now live in California, and I'm bringing in a teaching from India. How does that all work? And as I say, the images of the gods and goddesses are cultural specific to India. But yet there's a consciousness that we're all connected to that goes beyond our individual consciousness. We have our family, our culture, our country consciousness that we are connected into. But there's also something maybe beyond that, more of a human collective consciousness that we can tap into in the depth of our psyche. And I always say our psyche and body are synonymous. So when we're exploring somatic work in our body, we're also touching into the psyche, where we can connect with these different consciousnesses, if you will, collective consciousness. So when we visualize an Indian-looking goddess, it's still touching us in the consciousness that we're holding inside that might be beyond what we recognize. So it's not limited. The images are not limited. And sometimes the image will morph into something that resonates with us more. Now, I tell people, don't try and change how she looks. But as she begins to shift, trust that the image is useful for the mind to connect to. But there's something beyond the image. That's the feeling tone that we're looking for, of that connection with that consciousness. And also on the collective consciousness, these teachings are brought in for awakening. It's spiritual teachings designed to recognize our true nature, higher states of consciousness, or more refined states of consciousness, and so forth.
Well, you mentioned earlier that people have really profound experiences, when you're delivering these teachings. And I'm curious if there's anything you'd be able to share with us.
Yeah. Okay. What comes forward right now is people having an experience of their heart opening to feeling not only love, but grief or pain or sadness directly in a field in which they're more able to be with it. Because both in these teachings of awakening and in healing trauma, we want to be able to feel more. I often say that emotions need to be felt in the body to be liberated, to be freed. Otherwise, they hang out. We suppress them, repress them, project them outwards. When we can develop the capacity to feel more, it allows then these emotions to dissolve. I think an emotion is something that's born into time. So it has a lifespan. And that lifespan isn't going to reach its pinnacle and then dissolve or die until that emotion is felt. It needs to be felt, especially I think the key emotions. They need to be felt in the body, not expressed, but felt. When we can feel them and embody them, they'll dissolve. We're not carrying them forward in our body from the past anymore. So what a lot of people will say is, wow, I'm actually able to feel more of this sadness or this anger or this rage than ever before. I don't have to act it out. It doesn't have to point back towards me and hurt me. I don't have to be afraid of it. So one of the reasons I use Chamunda, this goddess who has a very, very fierce image, very fierce implements she's holding. One of the reasons I bring her in is if we get to a place where we're either working with the mantra and the visualization, spiritual practice, and trauma is about to come up, if it feels a little bit too much, here we have this fierce goddess, right, who can hold that rage for us. So she becomes a container, if you will. And because the experience is actually feeling her there as an energy that people are connecting to, they can say, okay, this is feeling too much. Take this for me, hold this for me, or help me feel this. And their experience is she does. She does. So we have to build a relationship with her, and that's done by repeating the mantra over a certain amount of time in a dedicated practice, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour a day. And then the experience begins to deepen. The contact, the relationship begins to deepen. And so we know complex trauma comes out of interpersonal relationships that were painful or frightening. So these practices bring us back into relationship. And we know healing trauma happens in relationship. So she can also be a stand-in, if you will, for a person to help heal relationally.
Yeah. Well, going back to the idea of the mother, as you were talking about, you know, an emotion being too much and asking the goddess to hold that, right? That's ideally what our parents would do, essentially, is create a safe container. So I got really emotional during that too. It's just so moving.
Yeah, it's tremendously moving to experience it, but to see people experiencing a support in a group while working with their trauma, including spiritual practice, and deepening into who they are, dissolving who they thought they were but aren't, and awakening at some level. And really, if we just look at awakening as including but going beyond who we ordinarily thought we were, which I think is always happening when we're healing trauma, we feel that interconnectedness with other beings and with the planet. And if we need anything right now for humanity, it's that interconnected with each other and the planet. Shout out for practices that can help support awareness of global warming right now. We are at a critical point. I just came back from Greece a few days ago, and I was on this amazing vacation. It was phenomenal. I was fortunate enough to be invited to spend some time on a yacht on the Greek Isles. Right? How gorgeous.
Wow.
The way the world is right now, trauma is always close by. So sure enough, there we were in the beautiful, pristine waters of the Aegean Sea, looking at these gorgeous islands. But we could see Turkey, and then the coast of Turkey burst into flames. And we could smell that smoke. And then, of course, we were looking at the videos to seeing what happened. And then Greece went on fire, some of the islands in Greece, and people fleeing their homes and their livelihood. I think it's the hottest year ever on record right now. So the impact of global warming is just around us.
Right.
More trauma coming up.
Right.
The point being, this interconnectedness, that resolving our own trauma can help us feel, allows us to wake up what's going on in our environment, which I think is super important right now.
Absolutely. And in terms of COVID, you know, what I've been reading is, you know, it's great if Americans all get vaccinated, but it's not going to do anything if we don't help other countries as well. And so there really is an interconnection with COVID that is literally undeniable, that we really do have to work to eradicate that together.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Speaking about COVID just a little bit, and complex trauma, just how that triggered complex trauma in people who had no idea it was there, from this sense of separation and disconnection. People were
Yes.
so confused as what was happening within them, and now maybe have a better understanding about disconnection and separation in childhood and what lives inside of them that they didn't know, that they are now on a path of healing, hopefully.
Right. And I imagine that the effects of this are going to reverberate for generations.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious too about your own journey of healing trauma, and if there's anything that you're willing to share with us about, the spiritual practices and NARM and how that has impacted your own healing.
Well, as I say, I think my path of passions began with spirituality, meditation, a deeply embodied meditation. And I followed that path. But when you're noticing these profound phenomena happening within the body, that set off this path to understand the body, which took me to understanding somatic psychology. So as I say, it's kind of began about 30 years ago. And what is the relationship between the body and spirituality? And of course, if you're working with the body and spirituality, you're going to be working with the mind, right? It's just a natural part of both of those. So that got me on a path of studying psychology as well. And I wanted to really see how trauma, spirituality, psychology, how did all the body, it wasn't trauma back then, the body, psychology, and spirituality, how did that all fit together? And I was fortunate on my spiritual path to have really beautiful opening experiences. Not everybody does. They have beautiful experiences, and then comes the trauma, and it's awful. A number of spiritual teachers refer people to me because I have an understanding of both spiritual states and trauma. What often happens is trauma will come up, obscure the expansive state that a person has. And then because that seems to go away, it doesn't really go anywhere, a lot of shame comes up, which is really unresolved trauma also coming up. But we project it into the moment, oh, it's just because I must have done something wrong that I'm not holding this expanded state. But usually it's something that's already inside, and these expanded states are allowing to come up. So you're asking about my personal, and I'm going off on a tangent, but I don't think spirituality actually triggered a lot of my own trauma. What happened though, what I realized was in profound openings of refined consciousness that can be held over a number of years, and even in states that are 24/7, so wakefulness, even in deep sleep, doesn't get you trauma. I know that directly. And I know that from the spiritual teachers I work with and the students and everybody that I work with. Spiritual states and the great expanse of that doesn't necessarily heal trauma. I think it can give us a lot, can hold a lot, can help us recognize a lot, but it doesn't heal trauma. So my own healing of trauma came through healing trauma. From recognizing my own trauma, NARM gave me a lot of that. No, I don't think I had a lot of what we thought of as the big traumas growing up, the obvious physical abuse, sexual abuse, profound neglect, and so forth. What NARM helped me recognize was those traumas that I think is really important for many people to understand is what we didn't receive that caused a threat inside of us that then we adapted to and then carried forward these adaptations thinking this is how I need to be or this is who I am in the world, not realizing it's a strategy to survive. And it's really tricky to see.
Yes, it is.
Right? And spiritual traditions aren't very good at being able to point that out. The trauma traditions, somatic psychology traditions, NARM specifically, I believe is amazing at helping us recognize that. It's also why I say to people on a spiritual journey, take a look at trauma. You might not think you are suffering from trauma, but take a look. It's fascinating. Because if you are on an awakening path, bet you there's something going on that could help facilitate that awakening if you explore trauma. I love to bring them together because they facilitate one another.
The word reorganization is coming to mind. And I've worked with a couple clients who, for lack of a better term, seem to be experiencing a spiritual awakening. And the reorganization and the shifting in their beliefs essentially created that opening where the trauma would come up. And so you're so right how these things go together. And I worry that our field, in absence of including spirituality, could be really harmful to people who are experiencing this sort of spiritual reorganization. You know, if a CBT therapist or, something very logical comes in and clamps down.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it can be harmful to ignore what we think of as spiritual energies and spiritual states as they open up, because they're a natural part of our human capacity and human beingness. They're a part of us. To ignore them can be detrimental. When I first began exploring trauma as trauma, there seemed to be two separate camps, trauma and spirituality. And the trauma people, looked with some disdain upon spirituality, as if spiritual people were all dissociated and living in this dissociated state. Fair enough, a lot of people who move towards spirituality have done so because of trauma, and they don't know that.
Right.
They have an affiliation with spiritual states and very valid, deep experiences. And yes, quite often they're not deeply embodied. But to disregard that I thought was very, very harmful. I could say the same for spiritual teachers still today. If you've awakened, you don't need to look at your trauma.
Right.
Right. So we got it both ways. So bringing them together is allowing what can naturally unfold, whether you're in a spiritual practice or a path of healing trauma. Each will support whatever's emerging or unfolding in our experience in the moment. And we don't have to disregard it. So just as the spiritual teachers are now referring to trauma therapists, sometimes it could be useful for a trauma therapist or a psychologist, if they're not familiar with spiritual states or different states of consciousness, to maybe have a referral base to be able to refer that person to as well. Or, take up a practice themselves and begin to understand and learn a little bit more about it, not to completely disregard it, because it's part of our unfolding, part of knowing who we are. And as you say, it can be very reorganized in our body, but it can also bring up more trauma, and we need a way to be able to balance those and finding that equilibrium within us for both to be happening simultaneously.
Yeah, my hope with the shift that you were talking about, feeling that we're bringing back the feminine energies, my hope is that we're also marrying science and mysticism, because that's exactly what you're talking about. And I'm so aligned with that.
Yeah. I think that's happening. I see it happening. And as we support it, this tremendous amount of healing is happening. And this is one of the reasons why I love Shri Vidya, is the feminine energy, the Shakti, but also the science behind it is profound. If one really chooses to go deep into understanding the geometry and the mathematics behind the Sanskrit alphabet, it's mind-blowing, mind-boggling. We don't have to go that deep in understanding it. We can take up a practice and have the direct experience ourselves, but the science is there for people who are interested. Just like the science is here in the somatic psychology now. We don't have to understand what's happening in our brain and our nervous system. And we have the experience, though, of reorganization and see it and feel it happening within us.
Well, I'm certainly inspired. So check that off the list. And I imagine other people are too. And if people want to find out more about you and workshops that you're doing, please tell us how to find you.
The first thing is to go to my website, which is my name, juliebrownyau.com. Yau is spelled Y-A-U. So juliebrownyau.com. I also have a Facebook is Dr. Julie Brown Yau, and I have an Instagram, Julie Brown Yau. So they are all being taken care of actually by an assistant. So she takes some things out of my book. I also have a book that people might be interested in called The Body Awareness Workbook for Trauma. Subtitle, The Scientific and Spiritual Approach to Healing Trauma. So I wrote the book as a support for people outside of sessions or to help them work with their own nervous system. But I also put some spiritual practice in there that's a little bit different than the mindfulness that is out there. That is useful in some ways, but the West has taken it an Eastern practice and dampened it down and forgot to talk about the potential of it connected to awakening in consciousness and expanded consciousness and so forth. But it's useful for what it does.
And what are the workshops that you have coming up?
So thank you. I have some workshops coming up in October and November, December. They're going to be webinars. They're still online right now. They're not on my website. But if people go to my website and sign up for the newsletter or information, then they'll get notified about the upcoming workshops. So I'm offering 2 workshops, 2 different goddesses, 2 completely different experiences, combining it with trauma. So it's education about trauma, talking about trauma. There'll be little pieces in there where I work with people with trauma, and then we jump into the explanation and then the actual spiritual practice. So if people sign up on the website, they'll get the information for when they can sign up for the classes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. I feel really moved by our conversation, and I know that listeners will resonate as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'd like to give a voice to trauma and spirituality and hopefully heal that relationship that got split. And even for people who aren't interested in spirituality, it gives an understanding of interconnectedness.
Yes. Well, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Please join us starting in September for our NARM Online Basics training to learn how to transform trauma. This NARM Online Basics training is available for helping professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it is essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. If you're looking for more advanced training in understanding the impacts of attachment, relational, developmental, and intergenerational trauma, and you're working in healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or other allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.